Welcome, everybody, to the American Library in Paris. I'm Rachel Donadio, the new curator of cultural programs here at the library. And we're welcome you to our newest conversation in Evenings with an Author. We are the largest English language lending library on the European continent, and we've been in operation for more than 100 years. Tonight, we're very glad to be here with Jamieson Webster and Sinziana Ravini talking about Jamieson's forthcoming book on breathing, which will be out next spring, but which has seen excerpts published in the New York Review of Books. We will talk for about, the speakers will talk for about 45 minutes, after which we will open things up to questions from the audience in person, and then if we have time, also from the audience on Zoom. Jamieson Webster is a psychoanalyst in New York City. She teaches at the New School for Social Research and is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and many psychoanalytic publications. She is the author most recently of Disorganisation and Sex and the forthcoming on breathing. And she'll be in conversation with Sinziana Ravini, who is a writer, journalist, and psychoanalyst living in Paris. She is also the editor-in-chief of the Swedish art journal Palliative. She has published Les Psychonautes in 2022 and La Diagonale du Désir in 2018. And she holds a PhD in literature from the University of Heidelberg, entitled Goethe's Schöpfungsmythen, published in 2009. Great to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having invited us. I'm so honored to be here with you again, Jamieson, in Paris. Last time I had a hat with me and you could pick up the questions, but this time I'm going to be much more rationalized in my questions. Anyway, you all know, I'm sure, Jamieson. She's perhaps one of the most brilliant writers and psychoanalysts I've ever met. You have written a beautiful PhD called The Life and Death of Psychoanalysis, where you also analyze your own dreams, conversion disorder, stay illusion, the Hamlet Doctrine, another book, Disorganisation and Sex, that we discussed last year, and now the marvelous book we are all going to discuss tonight, namely on breathing. You have taken it's not only about breathing, mostly about the air, and I've been traveling a lot lately, so I've been very much up in the air and always read you up in the air. So you have taken us to very high levels, I would say, in this book, without having to lose contact with the ground, like a modern Saint Theresian figure which instead of God puts the other in the place of God, I would say, because there is a lot of ecstasy in ecstatic writing, I would say. One thing that I truly adore about your writing is that you are criticizing things without judging, an ethos that you're also yourself mentioning in the book, how important it is to criticize without judging. You also have a very immersive auto-analytical and world-analytical writing, a writing that does a lot of border linking, if I would use a Brasher-Lichtenbergian term, a psychoanalyst we both very much love. And the British writer Tom McCarthy has written about it recently, saying that being dragged into the orbit of Webster's mind is like entering the magic mountain. You go in as a visitor and stay as a patient. And I thought it was a beautiful description of what you're actually doing with us. I would also like to add that you are inviting us to also enjoy our suffering, enjoying our symptoms, and at the same time offering us a cure. It's a breathtaking and breath-giving book you have written, and a true Atemwende, if one should use Paul Celan's word. So I'd like to start by asking you the following very, very simple question. What was the intention with this book, and what was the big discovery while writing it?
Thank you, Sinziana. I'm humbled, and I hope the book lives up to what you said. It's very new. It's not going to be published until March, and I just finished it a couple months ago. So it's a very fragile moment to talk about it. I think the question came, which was part of the New York Review of Books piece that you mentioned, for me when I was working in COVID, and I was working as a palliative care psychologist. And it wasn't so much the fact that breath and the threat to breath that was coronavirus that was on my mind, but the fact that the people who were in charge of caring for those who were struggling to breathe were made very, very anxious and sometimes very, very angry about the struggle of watching people not be able to breathe. And this was amongst the nurses and the doctors and the staff in the hospital. Of course, they were very, very scared, and they were also dying. But I thought, what is so hard about watching people struggle to breathe? Of course, I remembered that I had asthma as a child, that my son had asthma from the age of 2 till the age of 12, and that we were in the hospital all the time. And so a whole world of struggling to breathe came to mind. I think, for the past 5 years, have heard patients talk about climate change. And it's not often that social events are shared by everybody who comes and speaks to you, but people saying things like, what's the point, or we're all going to die, or the air is all going to be polluted, or I don't even know why I'm bothering to come here and talk to you, because the world is killing itself. And so these kinds of questions in the background made me want to do a deep dive into the question of breath. And part of the great discovery, or the wild discovery, was to realize that at the scene of the inception of psychoanalysis, the question of breathing was everywhere. So many people don't realize that Freud, who wrote Studies in Hysteria with Breuer was a pulmonologist. Freud's quasi-analyst Wilhelm Fliess, he and Freud were obsessed with the nose. They had this idea of men tracking when their nose filled with mucus, and that it would be something like a woman's period. It would happen, in a cyclical way. And actually, it's funny because it sounds completely crazy, and it was a bit crazy between them, but our nose does cycle. We cycle left and right with our nostrils. Like some nights we breathe with the left nostril, the next night the right nostril, and so on and so forth. And a lot of this is within the knowledge of yoga, in fact, this sort of left-right breathing, which has something to do with the two sides of the brain. So they were onto something. On top of that, the question of the first, the first breath of the baby and the first experience of a foreign environment, and having to take something foreign into the body, which is air, was a big topic for the early psychoanalysts. And, what is this the moment when there's a kind of nodding between subject, environment, other, anxiety, and an experience of the body under threat? And the idea that many of them had was we had to go back to this first moment. And you see in the 60s things like primal scream therapy, right? As if you had to go back through your terrifying birth experience in order to finally get past your neurotic illness. I mean, we don't believe this so much today, but there's something still interesting about the speculation. And as the psychoanalysts speculated more and more on this territory, the wilder and really quite interesting their theories became. And it became a site of a lot of contention, a lot of fighting, a lot of disagreements. And unfortunately, I think a great repression in some ways, that they just, it was there and it went underground. And the other thing I read, which is, like the New York Times bestseller by James Nestor, Breath, The Ancient Art of a Lost Wisdom, he goes through the fact that going back to the beginning of time, we keep rediscovering the importance of breathing, and we keep forgetting it. The very basic idea that we should breathe through our nose and not our mouth, because there's something about the immune functioning and the cleansing act of breathing through the nose, is we forget this over and over. And yet it's a part of every mystical tradition, in a way. So what is this forgetting of the air? What is this repression of the question of breathing? And then why is it so prominent in today's world? Why is it that we keep confronting it under the guise of threat, actually? So that was the starting point.
Yeah, it's almost like a... Sorry, it's almost like you have discovered a blind spot in our society, because when you wrote me an email some months ago asking me, can you come up with a quote on breathing, I couldn't actually come up with any of those. And that told me something about the fact that we're never thinking of it. And as you said, we're also forgetting it. You begin your book by claiming that giving birth to a second child just after the COVID pandemic, when you were so highly involved taking care of people dying from it, and also I discovered in the 11th of September, you were also very much involved in it. You're such a true warrior, taking out psychoanalysis in the public field. You are also a reconnection with the subject matter of breathing and the relation to height and airplanes, and your father. Can you tell us something about the ending and the beginning of these two very important people in your life and how it affected your writing in this book.
Well, my daughter was born shortly after the pandemic in 2021, and my father died in June 2022, so there was a very death moment. And he didn't die of COVID, he died of a rare form of leukemia, but I do think that COVID neglect of the elderly was responsible for a kind of hastened demise, and he in fact survived the cancer but died from the prolonged effects of the cancer on his body. So even though the chemotherapy worked, he decided that there was too much disintegration to his kidneys and nervous system that he didn't want to continue on dialysis, he didn't want to live. And so, if anyone is with a child in the first years of their life, I mean, the question, you watch them sleep, you watch them breathe, you worry about them, you have this like imagination of sudden infant death syndrome, which is that they stop breathing in the middle of the night. You want to watch all the time. They're drinking milk all of the time. There's something about the mouth, the nose, the sounds they make, the enjoyment in beginning to make sounds, the enjoyment that they experience in their body. So there's all of this at the same time that my father is disintegrating. And I think that this is really the ground of the book, and part of what I began to discover about the question of air came from the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. He wrote a massive tome. It's 3,000 pages. It's called Spheres. And it's a reconceptualization of the entire history of everything, as philosophers love to do, from the perspective of air, of bubbles, of our interest in spheres, and also foam. He's interested in foam because it's as if it's like tiny little pockets of air or bubbles. It's a different configuration for him. But his great discovery, I think, is in the part of it that he calls atmoterrorism. And he says that the 20th century is the moment in which something that was a background given, namely air, steps into the foreground as an object and then becomes an object of technology. So in the 21st century, we have submarines and we have air conditioning. We also have gas warfare and we have gas chambers. And we have scuba equipment, and we have all kinds of breathing apparatus. We also have the invention of intubation, right, which was obviously a big part of the pandemic, was the question of trying to help people breathe with a machine. So all of this technology for him is part of a mastery and violence that we enact on the air. And airplanes are also part of this. We're all traveling through the air all the time in ways that would never have happened, and we're polluting the air as we do so. And so he talks about this takeover. My father was, he was in the Marines. He was very poor, and this is how he got out of poverty. And he never managed to fight in a war, but he became a commercial pilot when there were no more pilots left because they were all in Vietnam. And so the question of all of these people flying through the air and the moment in which we were all completely grounded for a period of time during COVID was so striking to me in terms of the fact that we have to ask a question of what on earth we have been doing. What have we been doing in the air? What have we been doing up there, mastering it, violently polluting it, without ever really being able to think about it and without understanding how it sustains us? And it's the thing that we hold in common. We somehow can't think about this sharing of the air. And I think, in fact, it might be the last thing that we have in common.
So would you say that... Would you say that the colonization of the air, in a way, is negative? Because I'm often thinking of the romantics, yeah, Goethe and the guys, and wondering whether they would have been that romantic if they would have been able to take an airplane somewhere and see the world from above. Would you say that we have lost something with this connection to other spheres and other heights?
I think we have. I think his idea is that our connection to a place, to a specific culture, to a locale, to an understanding of it, to a feel for it, we are all displaced all over. We're all diaspora in a way at this point. And globalization. It's not. I really, in this book, there's a way in which I wanted to fight a tendency to romanticize the past, and to feel like there's a more natural relation that we have to get back to, because I think it's a foreclosed possibility. It's a done deal. And it's really only a question of imagining forward from where we have gotten to at this point in time. So, I mean, we can look back at the Romantics and what they made possible because of their connection to a certain kind of atmosphere that they loved or was the source of their inspiration and imagination. And the imagination of the air is so important. I mean, Bachelard talks about it as a soul expansion. You're always extending yourself into some space that's not yours. But we have deliriously extended ourselves into space. I think of the author Kare Diem, who said, we are the middle children of the planet. We are too late for the earth and too soon for the stars. And so we're sort of crawling in this space in between, not knowing where we're going to end up. I mean, we'll end up in outer space, I guess, but it's not for us. It's for 3 generations from now.
I just now thought that you actually remind me of an important sociologist who wrote about the, what was his called? He was writing about the nomadic person that he was, Sigmund Bauman, who said that the nomad, there's nothing more static than the nomad. Yeah. So perhaps being up in the air is a way of being very close back to, put to the ground in a way, in chains. But can you tell us a little bit about how you actually connected Peter Sloterdijk to Marx? And because I really like the way you intertwine thinkers, it's always very beautiful. And you were saying something about the dimension of soap bubbles and what they do to us, and they vanish. The sound of the soap bubble that scared your child, and how everything that is solid melts into the air. Would you say that one can think the other way around? That
I never, it's really only in writing this that you hear Marx in a completely different way. I mean, of course we all know all that is solid melts into air, but you immediately think, commodities and everything's turning into the abstract ideology of money. But putting this with Sloterdijk was the idea that, everything that is solid is now in the air. That we've given up our relationship to the ground, to space, to life, to living somewhere. And what this globalization has done to us, and my daughter loves bubbles. Last year we were here, and there's the woman at the Louvre who does the bubbles. I mean, she's like this magical person from another era. She's also very mean, which I like. She gets mad at them if they get too close to her, because the kids are all going crazy, and she tells them to stop. But she really loves bubbles, and Sloterdijk puts this image forward as something, the breath that can be encapsulated for a moment, so that you understand it, you see it, you play with it, you see its presence and absence, you see it suddenly appear and vanish, and the child's magical relationship to this, that I do think we become just disenchanted from in our forgetting of the air or in our lack of appreciation for it. And balloons. I mean, balloons are wonderful, and a child's attachment to a balloon is so stunning. Of course, she's watching the red balloon, and the feeling that you can have for this, both at the end he flies up into the air, but you watch it crumble to the ground, and it's completely devastating. And I really, everyone knows Freud's example of the Fort Da, when the child throws the yo-yo out of the cart, and he says, my mother's gone, my mother's back, and he's trying to master this coming and going of the other person. And I thought maybe the soap bubble is the better one for us now, not the yo-yo anymore, because we don't even have that visceral attachment, but the thing that goes and vanishes into thin air. And that we have to find a way to appreciate, even though it's so ephemeral, right? It's so fragile, so ephemeral, so precarious, in a way that the toy isn't as much, right? The sort of concrete toy that you have in your hands.
Wow. You add a lot of new thoughts to your writing. I hope you can put them add to the book, because I also was thinking about how you were working with patients that were suffering from anxiety. And could you give us some examples? I was thinking about this psychotic patient who wanted new lungs, and you said, wow, that's such a beautiful symbol. Hi, Brasha. We were talking about you earlier, saying that you, in a way, also doing some border linking. And I was just asking you, could you give us some examples of how you work with them, helping to breathe anew and perhaps even better or differently from before?
Yeah. I had a patient in the hospital when I worked inpatient. It's decades ago. But he would come every day and he wanted a new body part. But the one that really kept returning was that, and he would say, "Can you go get me a spleen from the spleen bank? Can you go?" And he had very interesting ones. Like, "Can you go get me hair buds from the hair buds bank?" I love this. But the lungs bank was one that returned again and again. And, you know, of course, the experience of schizophrenia is the experience not only of bodily disintegration, but the attack of the voice from the air, in fact, from the outside. And I thought the lungs bank must have been important for this reason, to find another relationship to sound, to breath. You know, we can't forget that speaking is breathing. We can't forget that speaking is the manipulation of the column of air in our bodies. So a big part of the book goes from the question of breath to the question of speech, and of course why speech is so important in psychoanalysis. And I'm a yoga practitioner. I think people think I'm writing like an Eastern philosophy yoga book. Someone said that they were relieved to find out that I was not going back on psychoanalysis and becoming like solely a breathing practitioner, which I thought was funny. But I appreciate the breathing therapies at this moment for what they're trying to do, which is that we're all trying to regain control of our nervous system. We're completely overwhelmed. And this phone is taking up our life. And I guarantee you that when you're looking at your phone, you don't breathe very well. No, I think it's really affecting us in this way. I think the internet is a breathless space. And so I think the vogue and the trend of breath therapies is coming from this. But we also have to remember that breathing is speaking. And I think the very basic idea in psychoanalysis, that you speak as freely as possible, that you change your relationship to your body through speech, is as important as gaining control of your nervous system.
And also the right to be silent, actually.
And the right to be silent. Yeah.
When I was in analysis, I used to hear the differences between the different breathings of my analysts. What about your analysis of breathing? How do you work with silences? Did it really make differences between different silences? How do you work when someone doesn't want to talk, or are you silent a lot? How do you work with that? Very
you'll have to ask my patients. I mean, you breathe together, and people forget, you know, how close you are to your patients. They're right there. You're right there next to each other, which is very different from this face-to-face thing, which I actually feel is much more distant. I mean, patients complain that they lose the getting to see you, but for me, it's much more intimate to have them lying down next to me. And you are breathing together, and you are very much responsible for one another's rhythms. And part of my thinking about the breathing and the speaking and the active analysis was to also understand that the analyst has to have control over their nervous systems. We don't always do the best job. But we also have to have the widest repertoire possible around our voice, the quality of voice, and the communication affectively through our voice of what we are hearing, what we're understanding, what we're metabolizing. And, you know, interpretation is often thought of as this application of ideas to the patient or something, or some, you know, telling the patient something. And I think this brings it into a much more bodily, intimate sphere. And a lot of what Sloterdijk is pointing out in his question of this kind of new 21st century atmosphere violence is that this is about a loss of intimacy. In our world, we are losing out pockets of intimacy. And so I wanted to rethink psychoanalysis as the attempt to reestablish new kinds of intimacy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also speaking about another thing that I thought was very beautiful, the wish to have the object A in the pocket. We want to speak about that aspect and how you personally, you would like to develop how you personally change an object for another in your pocket, if you know what I mean. Just as change to another dimension. There are so many things. I have 33 questions here, so I want to.
Sinziana also had a lot of questions in her hat the last time. We didn't get to make it through.
Yeah.
A lot of the object A in Lacan is the question of the particular objects that psychoanalysis likes to think about. So it's the very classical ones that are named the breast, or the feces, or the gaze, or the voice. It's something ephemeral, but it's something at a certain point of exchange between body and other. And that language marks, because there's a lot of interactions around eating or around breathing that you have with another at the very early developmental stages of life. Same goes for toilet training, same goes for sexuality, and same goes for the looking at each other or the speaking to one another. But the question of this object is that it's not an object that we have, in fact. It's something we circle around and never quite have, although we sometimes think someone has it and we want it, or we think they've taken from us and we want it back. And, I wanted to translate into this object the question of the object of breathing, if breathing has an object which is air, and which is shared, and which no one can have. And that we have a lot of fantasies about having it, in fact, as if we could cordon off a space away from the others. And to really, sort of put this back into the dimension of the question of the human objects. It is one of our objects. And Lacan said that he wondered if there was a respiratory drive and what its object would be. So he never developed it, he never really talked about it, but I sort of took up the fact that he asked this question without ever answering it, and I guess this book is an attempt to...
Would you say that you are developing a fifth object? You usually say that there are 4 A objects.
I wish I had the megalomania to say
yes, please do.
Yes, I have developed a fifth drive and a fifth object.
Because it's also very intangible, like all the other 4th objects.
Yeah.
And I would say that, in a way, you're showing that we're more lacking than we are. I don't know if you agree with me.
Yes.
Because nobody has it. We run after air. So you're making us more desiring than we actually were.
There's a really beautiful example by Winnicott who says that he says one of the things that can happen is we can think that we're lacking air, that we're lacking breath. And there's no lacking of breath. There's a question of changing your relationship to breath and the rhythmicity that you have, or your anxiety about it, but you're not lacking in breath. But he loved the example of a little girl who was explained oxygen. And he said that she immediately started saying she needed more of it. Just to show you the minute that you try to grab it as something.
What did you mean, by the way, with the breath signature of the hysteric?
Oh, the breath signature of the hysteric.
Oh, breath. Yeah, sorry. I meant breath. Breath signature of the hysteric. I thought it was so cryptical.
Franco Bifo Berardi actually should be credited because he wrote a book on breathing in 2013, shortly after the killing of Eric Garner by police and the beginning of the I Can't Breathe Black Lives Matter movement. And of course this came back with George Floyd in the pandemic, but he already wrote the book then when it was still a less known movement than it became during the pandemic. And it's a lovely book. And part of what he says about the book is that we will have to, in the chaos and violence of the 21st century, have to develop new rhythms. And part of developing new rhythms is poetry, different ways of being together, different ways of organizing the body and space, different forms of breathing, our own and with others. And he thinks that this is where the future lies, because we are all part of an I Can't Breathe together. And so I really think that what patients develop in analysis or create in analysis is something new. They create their particular style of living and enjoying and suffering and surviving. They create whatever they will make of their life that sustains them. And I was thinking about this as a new signature, a new breath signature. And I liked it much more than the old thing like James Joyce makes a name for himself for all of eternity to be in beautiful lending libraries like this one. But something a little less tangible than that, and a little less like my stamp, my thing, my, Yeah.
I also very much love the parts in the book where you talk about the madness with the masks and the people that try to not use masks in order to say that they are free to do so, putting their own freedom about others. And you say that this kind of freedom is a private luxury, and there is another much bigger freedom, and that the one in psychoanalysis that we have, where we can actually speak freely. But would you really say that we can speak freely, or are we in a way castrated by language? It's a very Lacanian question, I know. Sorry.
Leave it to the Lacanian. No, in the
cabinet. I mean,
in the cabinet. There's a lot in the book that is against what I take to be a particularly American ethos of negative freedom, my freedom, which we saw on steroids during the pandemic, when the freedom was the freedom to die and make others sick, so that no limitation could be imposed on you, that this was the freedom that we have to fight for. I mean, it was really delirious. It was very, very crazy and scary. As if what we are free to do is spread death at will, right? And to each his own. And, of course, we all know Lacan said, I never speak of liberty, the closest, the bedfellow of freedom is madness. And this question of a different freedom that is a freedom based on the restrictions that we all accept together in order to live together. We have to accept a certain imposition against our freedoms. And Freud had a very interesting distinction. He said, sometimes we fight against a limitation in order to create a new possibility for humans, a new recognition of someone who has suffered. He goes, but sometimes we fight for freedom in hatred against civilization, which imposes limits on us. This, he said, was neurotic.
Can you repeat it again? Sorry. Sometimes we fight for...
Sometimes we fight for an injustice, a freedom to include something in civilization that hasn't been included. And this is important. But he said a lot of the fight for freedom is a hatred for civilization and the limits that it must impose on us so that we can live together in a just way. And it's the second that he called neurotic. And I think this is a really important point. So it's not speak freely as in do what I want, say what I want in order to do what I want. But the question of what it means to speak and recognize what limitations we share and how we suffer from them and how we can accept them in our life and be less hateful towards civilization as shared civilization.
Yeah, you're in a way taking us out of the Unbehagen in das Kultur, in a way.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
Yeah.
Well, I have just I have so much more questions, but I should perhaps only take one of them. We have Wilhelm Reich, cloud-busting. We have Bachmann, Freud, Sloterdijk's terms of atom terrorism, but you have already mentioned it. I prefer to actually finish by reading a little passage of yours, if you agree with me.
Sure.
That I think captures all the dimensions of the book in a nutshell. It is so surprising that a large part of this story of breath is about the troubled relationship between a father of the air and a daughter on the ground. The story ends, or rather begins again, with his dying and my having a daughter myself. Her birth spelled his end, showing him all that he would not live to see, the man who saw everything flying from the friendly skies. I saw this on his face when he first looked at her. Women and other minorities have, for a long time now, had to carry this projection of death. It makes us one with the air, which of all the elements has the closest affinity with nothingness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamieson. You're such an important thinker to me, and I really love the way you always intertwine the personal and the political and the psychoanalytical dimensions of our everyday life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We should perhaps open up for some questions.
All right. Am I on? Anybody have any questions? Don't be shy.
Thoughts too.
Thank you so much. Is it on? Thank you, Jamieson. I haven't read the book yet. I hope I can buy it tonight. So is that we have a neutrality or maybe even anesthesia towards the breath, but I just wonder, could you speak to maybe the shame that goes along with breathlessness? Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
It's the medical anthropologists were really interesting on the question of breathing, because there's many kinds of illness and injury that we can experience, but the question of laboring moment to moment, they said that they really think there's nothing else like it. And the question of the other person watching that laboring, from moment to moment in an unending way. And I thought a lot about when I had asthma and my son, and also, raising my son who would get really, really extreme asthma and would end up in the hospital every year. And there's a certain kind of trying to hold yourself together that you're doing all the time. And someone quoted that Proust, who had asthma, looked like he was always husbanding his strength. Which I sort of loved this phrase about it, that you are always trying to let the other person know that you're okay as you're trying to find your own strength within yourself to reassure the others around you. So this immediate connection to the reassurance of the other around breath is in view, which might not necessarily be the case with other difficulties and other injuries. Yeah.
Someone else? Don't be shy.
Patrick?
Yes, I was very interested by your connection between speaking and breathing. And first, I have perhaps some question or remarks. So when you breathe, you don't notice. You breathe without noticing. As when you speak, there is something that is noticeable. I mean, when you take the floor, when you speak, it's an act of will, I would say. And then you said, with the new technology, people are less speaking and less breathing. But isn't it that they are compensating this perhaps unnoticed fact that they are less breathing by organizing their breathing, like jogging? Or you have all these people who are more and more organizing something that is natural and could be even more natural, because when you speak, it's an act of will, but you don't notice that it has an impact on your breath, as when you jog. You do it, or you swim, for the breathing. Mm-hmm. So isn't it that there is something that I'm saying things completely in disorder, but I think you have more and more people organizing the things that used to be natural. Mm-hmm. They are making it mechanical, organized, professional. They pay people for helping them doing it, etc., etc. That's something I thought about while listening to a wonderful conversation.
I mean, the kind of mastery and play, but a kind of wild athleticism around breath, I think goes back a long time. And people can do incredible things. There's parts in the book where I talk about, free divers. It's incredible what they can do. 24 minutes not breathing. They can tap into something in our phylogenetic history of having been in the water and crawled onto land and having to learn to breathe. They can go back and they can desaturate their blood of oxygen and be underwater and withstand extreme pressures. Now, of course, they also die all the time. I mean, there's something very death-driven to go back to what would maybe be the most natural form of breathing, which is not breathing by breathing in the water, or breathing as we did as fetuses. But playing with this is old. where we are now, where we're so desperate. I mean, I can't survive a week without going to yoga 3 times. I mean, there's a desperation and a weakness or something around it. I mean, I just feel like I can barely catch up with whatever necessity it is to remember to breathe again. So it's interesting that it goes all the way back, but we're still where we are, even with the fact that we've mastered it in these incredible ways over time. I mean, you know that everyone's into Wim Hof breathing, right? So you do this like heavy breathing where you take in excessive carbon dioxide. And then, I don't know, then you can like lie in the snow and not feel it for 20 minutes and like melt all the snow around you. I mean, it's true. It works. You can do it. You can change the body temperature from one half of your body into the other half. You can do this if you master breathing. And yet here we are. I think Thomas Mann said we're with our last tatters of breath, we're crying out to the gods. So, strange place to find ourselves.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. I was just wondering, a bit of a swerve away from breathing, about your role as an analyst in palliative settings and how that differed from your kind of general practice as an analyst, how it changed, how your role differed, the relationship with the patient, the analysand, or just any other reflections.
My partner accuses me of rubbernecking chaos and trauma, and he might be right. And a little bit of the book was, I reflected, I think, much later after the pandemic and in the writing of it on, in anyone who heroically stomps into something, that there's an omnipotence and there's a denial of death in there as well. So let's not like totally heroicize what happened. But so I was in 9/11 and I worked there as a psychologist at Ground Zero in my first year of graduate school. And then I was part of the Reserve Corps in New York from that event. And they call up every once in a while, like, we need help. And I saw the call. And so that's how I ended up doing the work in COVID. But crisis intervention is very different from the really long-term, almost lifelong engagement with patients. I mean, you're there for a moment of crisis versus being with someone over long spans of their life. But I think what a psychoanalyst, knows is the wrong word, but the sensibility, let's say, of the psychoanalyst in those extreme situations, I think is incredibly useful. Because everybody's panicking, and there's something about the question of finding the course or finding the place where you can calm something down or open up some space or listen that you often see other people can't have. And you will see this any day on an inpatient ward. You will see someone heroically step into a situation that could get catastrophically violent and settle it. I mean, a good psychoanalyst, I think, knows how to do that. So, I mean, there's a relationship between the two that's very important to me. I love the tradition here in Paris of the Maison Verte by Françoise Dolto. I mean, that's not psychoanalysis, but it's an incredible intervention into life, that there's a space for mothers and children to come to speak to an analyst should they want to, or not. They're also allowed to just come and not talk to her. And that's not the same thing that we do with patients, but it's an intervention at a place where there's something fragile, which is the first 3 years of a child's life. I mean, we don't have anything like this in America.
But wouldn't you say that the psychoanalyst also sometimes has to be interventionist within the cabinet? I mean, Lacan was very interventionist.
Absolutely.
Sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the image of the passive lying there Buddha analyst is, I'm not so fond of this.
What is the most unorthodox thing you have done as
Oh
a
my
psychoanalyst?
God. Oh my God.
I had to ask that.
I mean, I guess I'll use the example from the book. I have one incident that I speak about in which a patient had a panic attack in my office. And it's in the section on anxiety where I'm asking about the relationship between anxiety and further developments past anxiety, which Freud was a very important distinction for Freud, because he said if you could have a symptom, a particular way that you suffer, this is much better than the diffusion of anxiety. Like anxiety is without the symptom that helps you. And this was the panic attack, and what happened to her body in my session was almost as if it was the movement from anxiety to symptom in the beginning of her cure. A different kind of cure, almost backwards, as if to get the symptom was then the end. But we were ending the treatment. And in a way I didn't know much, because it sort of felt like she stayed in the anxiety. But in the last month of the session, she had a panic attack in the office, and her hands had the paralytic kind of almost hysterical, like you would see in the Salpêtrière. And I immediately jumped up and I said, "Don't look at your hands, look at me." Because I saw that as she was looking to the hands doing this, the panic was intensifying. And then I started to open her hands. I started to use my hands to open her hands, and then we got the situation down. But so I touched my patient and I massaged her, and I jumped out of my seat, and I suppose it's unorthodox now. Come to me for a massage.
I'm sure that Ferenczi would have loved it. You know, the guy that used to play games and ask the patient to take his place and take the patient's place. He was very unorthodox.
Thank you. Hi. It used to be that the first and last breath were sort of the bookends to a life. Yeah. Like you're born and you take your first breath, and it attests of your coming into life, and then you die, you take your last breath. And this is no longer quite true because of technology and because air can be forced into your lung. How do you think this has changed our relationship to living?
No, it's a beautiful question. I mean, also intubation technology, it was first developed and then it was developed for preemies. So now we have these babies that can be born before they're able to be born and survive on their own. So it is really changing the question. And there's many, there's many legal situations around the question of the intubated patient and how long we intubate them and keep them alive. But we have a real question about what are the limits of life at this point? I mean, we extend life or save babies that otherwise would not be able to survive on their own, but we don't ask a question about the quality of life of our citizens who are here. And I, really in terms of the pandemic, as we were obsessed with stockpiling intubation machines, I mean, this was the first thing that everyone wanted to do. There were a million questions to ask about quality of life for children who were on school on Zoom, or questions of quality of life for old people who were at home that we just did not ask, as we were obsessed with making the people who couldn't breathe. And I think you're pointing to the fact that this is kind of true all around, or true for medical technology in general, or just technology, period. Extension of life, not questions of care.
I met a French philosopher, Cynthia Fleury, last weekend in Romania at Nuit de Philosophie, and she said something very beautiful. She said we should be very unsentimental about care.
I agree.
Be able to, and you have a very unsentimental way of writing when you come to care, and dismantle some things that we thought were right, and that's very important, I think.
Thank you. That's a really nice way of putting it. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I mean, I feel very. My publisher, really wanted a subtitle because that's an American thing, I guess. My British publisher did not need one. And we went through many, and we ended up with Care in a Time of Catastrophe. And I like the word, but I hear the sentimental version of it, and I really struggled with it for a little while. But I have come to, in the writing of the book and the thinking of everything, to be, I'm okay with care. And of course we have Bracha here, whose work is based on carrions, as she calls it, and I quote you in the introduction.
Because also, don't forget that the word care itself became instrumentalized.
Yes.
We mean healthcare, mental care, We mean in that context already something which is alienated from the basic notion of care.
Yeah.
And so to that alienation and becoming technological and also somehow systematic and so on, idea of care, we have to relate to it as a subgroup. Care could not be reduced to that idea that we care, I care for my car, I care for my frigidaire, I care for my ventilator, I care for, taking care. Mm-hmm. We talked yesterday on another circumstances in care in Heidegger, which is entirely, finally, I am obliged to take care and I would better not invest anything for myself. In any case, caring for whatever which is out of itself is he does not consider at all. So there is a reduction on the same time instrumentalization, generalization, and we think that we know what we say when we say care. Mm-hmm. So I would say there are different kinds of care. Yeah. When you care for a patient that you know that you will see in urgency and then go home and care for other things. While when you care for your baby, it's simply not the same zone. No. We use the same words, and I put carrions because of the idea of caring and carrying and the rest of it. Yeah. But we need to pay attention. Some kinds of types of care, if they go without the breathing and the soul, they do not contribute to humanizing. Mm-hmm. They are very important. We depend on endless forms of care and public care. But there's also another, to the question that was asked here, I was thinking about the name of your daughter.
Tell me.
And in Hebrew, breathing is neshima, soul is neshama. The root for breathing and for soul is the same.
Isn't it the psyche? Isn't that the same thing?
The psyche also.
Psyche in Greek, isn't it the same?
There are two words in Hebrew. It's not that word. There is the word nefesh, which is also neshifa, which is the part of breathing that the air goes out. This is the psyche. Neshima is the general word, but also where the air gets in. So you have here the soul and here the psyche, and you have different degrees that Kabbalist and mystical are using. But on the general term, what God is doing is putting the breeze into us. And when to say gently in Hebrew, he died, you say he gave back his soul and breathing, breath, same right. Word, to God. So the question is not only technical, where do we see starting life, ending life, but it has to do in that zone of association with the question of the human soul.
You can hear it in English, I think, with the idea of spirit, with the inspiration and ruach.
Ruach. You have the ruach, you have the neshama, and you have the nefesh. So spirit, you have spirit, soul, and psyche and body. This is the four classical domains. The spirit also from the same words, the ruach.
What would be interesting is to know how you work with it practically, on a practical level as a psychoanalyst. bracha. That's how you connect
With the
them.
soul.
Yeah, with the soul. And how do you work? How do you care when you care?
The question of the ethics of the psychoanalyst, the responsibility of the psychoanalyst is very important to me. We're not perfect, and we have to stumble and find our way. But you are carrying a lot of people with you, and I think you sign up for that. I mean, I'm often shocked how, when someone has a problem and they can't pay the fee, how often people cut them off very quickly. And I always, everyone wants to sort of attack psychoanalysts that like we just want money or something, but I say we make the least money compared to the other therapists who see you once a week, who don't, we lower our fees to see you more. We see you more for less. That's what happens when you're a psychoanalyst. And if something happens in your life, we meet you there. And it's not about what our fee is, it's what the patient can afford. And you have to accept that. You have to find a way to make a living, you have to live, but we do what we can.
Adapting to the patient.
Yeah.
Every patient brings his or her own method, I would say. Yeah.